are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Hello, this is Dane Wigington with the weekly edition of GeoEngineering Watch Radio Global Alert News for June 25th, 2016. This show is broadcast on KQMS Saturday mornings, 6 to 7 a.m. for internet listeners who don't know that. This is in Northern California. It's a commercial-free news hour. Too many issues that need to be exposed to have commercial interruptions or to have any influence from outside sponsors. I want to go over a very important film I talked about last week, talked about it in previous shows as well, that started a one-week run at the Anderson Valley 11 Theaters in Anderson, California, just outside of Redding. It's showing in many places around the country, but it's showing there now for 1 week. Showtimes at 2:25 and 7:25 p.m. On the last day of the run, which will be next Thursday, showtimes will be at, I believe, 2:05 and 7 p.m. This film is extremely important to view. And for those who have been completely convinced by the power structure controlled corporate media that they know the whole story, that there's no dangers with vaccinations, simply isn't true. And this film vaxxed from cover-up to catastrophe, that's the full title of the film, is not saying that there is no potential for a vaccination to do good. This film is exposing the fact that some of the elements added to the vaccinations are extremely harmful and doing an immense amount of damage. And this is a responsibility for all of us to view this and understand that we are not being told the whole truth about vaccinations, period. And any parent who shows any responsibility to their child, and all of us, whether we have children or not, have a responsibility to children, this film is simply a must-see film. There's flyers on this film at Orchard Nutrition. They have some free tickets at Orchard and at KQMS. We hope those tickets can be used for those who perhaps can't afford to buy the tickets themselves. We want to make sure everyone who wants to see the film can. If you can afford to buy a ticket, we ask that you would, so that we can use the free tickets for those who perhaps couldn't afford it otherwise. This film, again, absolutely moving people to the marrow, shocking their perception of reality. Hope all can go to see this film and to research the data in it further and understand that on so many levels, from what's happening in our skies to what's being injected into the veins of our children, we are not being told the whole truth, period. With all that we face, I'd like to reflect again in a philosophic sense that with all that's surrounding us, so much, the walls are closing in from every side, and we learn every day, we're learning more, that we've all been living in a Truman Show, if you will. That so much of what we have believed is simply not true, simply a lie, propagated by those in power, while the masses have been distracted with material wealth and gain. Here's an excerpt from Epictetus, the lame slave who was the mentor for Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Epictetus is a Stoic philosopher, and this is not about any particular belief system at all. You can find this type of wisdom in every major tradition if you look, and if you sift through the dogma, if you will. 2,000 years ago, Epictetus said this: "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." That's what matters. There's so much that's outside each of our personal control that happens in all of our lives, but what matters is how we react to it. A final statement from Epictetus to go with that. Circumstances don't make the man. They reveal to him who he is. This is what forges all of us in the fires of difficulty in life. If we didn't have difficulty, we would never grow. And the times we face now are immensely difficult on every front, and that's going to accelerate. It means we have to polish our philosophy, our perspective, our sense of purpose in being. Because the storm is coming, absolutely coming. Let's get to that, speaking of the weather. On the record heat front, it's happening all over the globe. With the exception of the engineered cool downs, which it appears the eastern U.S. is going to be a focal point of that again. Why? Why would climate engineers focus on cooling down a particular region of a particular country? The U.S. population is the last potential counterbalancing force to the collective insanity that now runs the world, which is disintegrating though, but still the U.S. population is something they fear. So to create division and confusion amongst the population as to the true extent of climate damage, while still continuing to damage the climate from many sources, countless sources, especially climate engineering itself. Engineered cool downs in the most populated regions of the U.S. tend to fuel the division and confusion of the U.S. population as to the true state of the climate when the planet is melting down around them. It's a psychological operation in many senses to hide the fact that the atmosphere is filling with methane, oceans are superheating, reefs are dying, fish are floating belly up all over the globe. We have record drought, record heat, record flooding, record low Arctic ice, record tree die-off. I would encourage anybody to research any of these statements I just made. Research it. If you think everything's fine, if you're convinced that this is all just internet theory, if you will, you can't imagine how wrong you are. And if any of us, just like with the Vaxxed film, if any of us care about the future of our children, all of us who do, we have a responsibility to find out what's going on and to readjust our priorities. Here's a few headlines to back up some of those statements I just made. India just had another heat index of 160. In April, India had a heat index of 165. That's the feels-like temperature. That's about 125 degrees and about 60% humidity. And these temperatures enter what's called the wet bulb syndrome. And that's a scientific term that describes conditions that are intolerable to the human body. Too hot and too humid. Heat index of 160. Imagine that. So as hot as it is in the U.S., it's worse in other places. Our skies continue to be filled with the climate engineering aerosols, solar radiation management. Those in power, same people who have made vaccinations, whatever the full agenda behind those vaccinations, we can all speculate at, but there's much more to them than what we've been told. Certainly, we have not been told the harm that not only can be caused by vaccinations, but is being caused. And again, consider this. In regard to vaccinations, we have MIT telling us on the record, for those who don't know who MIT is, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, research institution known throughout the globe, telling us that in less than 9 years, every other child will have autism. Every other child. Isn't that enough to make you go see that film and find out what you don't know? When there's a top government official from the Center for Disease Control stating in the film, on the record, on tape, that the CDC has been hiding information about the vaccinations and the ingredients that are being put into the vaccinations that make them so harmful? Please see the film. And on every other front, from the climate to climate engineering, we are not being told the truth. From China, yesterday, extremely deadly tornado, 100 dead, 500 people injured, 200 of them critically. The headline states, after massive tornado rips through province. How many people saw that headline on our U.S. mainstream news that simply talks about the candidate election political theater? And now we have, of course, on the economic front, as I've stated over and over, as the biosphere implodes, there will be economic dominoes beginning to fall. The Brexit scenario is one of those dominoes. And if you relate that scenario to simply being triggered by a vote and having nothing to do with the biosphere, resources, and so forth, that's simply missing the point. We have this type of scenario happening because the biosphere is no longer able to produce enough for the lifestyle and population that exists on our planet. And as that happens, you'll have this type of economic breakup continuing and accelerating. It's just the beginning, absolutely just the beginning. So back to the biosphere, back to what's happening in China, when we don't hear about headlines like a tornado that's so incredibly deadly, because our media's job, our mainstream media's job, is to distract us from whatever's going on around the world. Too many Americans are too willing to exist in that paradigm. They don't want to know. They don't want to know. Sorry if this offends anybody, but that's the coward's way out. Absolutely the coward's way out. And as I've stated in previous shows, as we have internationally recognized psychoanalysts like Scott Peck and others, experts, top experts in the world in their field, stating emphatically the hallmark for a healthy mind is an unyielding willingness to face the truth no matter how dire. And if we had more in the population like that, we would not be in this mess. We would not have a criminal government in place in all governments around the globe, all of them. Not just ours, all of them. But the criminality is in direct proportion to the size of the governments. Who's the biggest? Who has the most powerful military by about 10 times over? We all know who it is. It's up to us to face that. It's up to us to expose it. It's up to us to change it. Another headline on the weather that's disintegrating, again, because of the damage that's been done to the biosphere from countless anthropogenic causes, with climate engineering at the top of that list. This is also from India. Lightning strikes kill almost 100. This kind of freak storm is happening over and over. And here's a statistic from another headline. Lightning strikes on a 10 to 24% increase. Phenomenon appears to be related to the climate. Well, of course it is. What else would it be related to? But it's also related to climate engineering, most directly, because climate engineering is filling the atmosphere with electrically conductive metallic particles that make the atmosphere much more prone to lightning strikes. So of course we see an increase. But we have the geoengineering elephant in the room that's not being disclosed. And again, back to the vaxxed film, the mercury that's in vaccinations. We have the mountains of aluminum raining down through our air column from the ongoing climate engineering operations, filling our skies with toxic metallic particles. The combination between these two metals, mercury and aluminum, increases the overall toxicity by as much as 10,000%. That's 100 times worse. We have peer-reviewed study to prove it. That's why the bees are dying. Primary element is aluminum. Search it online. As I state in every show, I'll state it just once in this show. Please investigate everything I say. Don't believe a word I say. Investigate it for yourself. Search bees/aluminum and find the peer-reviewed study I'm talking about. Bees are dying from symptoms resembling Alzheimer's and autism because they are packed with aluminum now. Because they're feeding off foliage that has aluminum settling down on it from the ongoing aerosol spraying of our skies that are part of climate engineering. Now we have also headlines like this one from Japan. Nearly 1 million people evacuated. 1 million, as almost an entire month of rain falls overnight. We don't hear these headlines anywhere. Yet we have massive protracted drought in the U.S. West. Although some areas got some rain, it dries out so fast afterward, the atmosphere dries out, because these particles I keep speaking about are desiccants. They absorb all available moisture in the atmosphere. That's why we don't see dew in the morning, almost ever, unless a storm has just passed. And we have trees dying everywhere in the West, all over the globe. As I've stated in previous shows as well, recent study proves we've lost about 3.4 trillion trees globally. 55%, over half of Earth's trees have now died or been cut down since the dawn of civilization, and that rate is accelerating unimaginably. So, we have the Brexit situation, we have the dominoes starting to fall economically. It's not going to turn around, it's not going to bounce back. Whatever temporary market inflation they manage to create with central bank money printing and buying stocks through the back door to try to keep the facade going, it's only temporary. Wait and see. A few headlines to add to the economic implosion, just to give a taste. Headlines we just don't generally see on mainstream media. Puerto Rico governor says shutdown won't prevent July 1st default. Puerto Rico is about to default. Just the beginning. Just the beginning. Another headline, sharp to lay off 7,000 people globally. How could the economy be getting better if that kind of layoff is happening from a company like Sharp? Again, we're all living in a facade, a total facade. The sooner we wake up to that fact, the more chance we'll have. Another headline on the economic front. Deutsche Bank to shut 188 German branches, to cut 3,000 staff members. Those are big cuts. Those are huge. Now, to try to weave this all together, again, as we have biosphere implosion, we have economic implosion, we have power structures that are ever more desperate around the globe. So I want to keep that theme present in everyone's mind so that these dots fit together more clearly. And when the power structure becomes more desperate, when they run out of options, they behave much more desperately. When we're told to fear ISIS, and ISIS is plugged into all the terrorist acts happening around the globe, and I'm not saying ISIS is not a very barbaric, unimaginably murderous group. They are. But again, who created them? Who spawned them? Who's supporting them even now? Here's a headline to back that up. Quote, Israeli intel chief, we don't want ISIS defeated in Syria. Think about that. Israeli is our staunchest ally, and they don't want ISIS defeated? From that report. In a speech at the, I'm probably slaughtering this name, Herzliya conference, Israel's military intelligence chief, Major General Herzi Halevi, took Israel's long-standing position that, quote, it prefers ISIS over the Syrian government to a whole nother level, declaring openly that Israel does not want to see ISIS defeated in the war. This is from the top military intelligence chief of Israel. So again, we have John McCain standing with ISIS leaders. We have Turkey, U.S. ally, helping to fund ISIS. We have Israel supplying food, medical assistance to ISIS, making sure that they are not defeated. What aren't you being told on Fox and CNN and MSNBC? Those corporations are simply designed to create the illusion of various sources of news, when in reality, all of them behind the curtain, all of them that control these corporations, are all part and parcel of the same power structure that is wreaking havoc around the globe. Continuing on this theme, another headline, NATO general admits Russia is not a threat to the region. It's what I've said all along, what many have said. This is simply, Russia's been used as a scapegoat for the expansion of NATO, for the desperate power structure that's running out of options and that needs to convince the American public that this is the enemy now. How long have we gone through this? How many times? From Saddam Hussein, who was created, sponsored by the West, given chemical weapons that he used to poison some of his own population in the late 80s, chemicals that came from the U.S., and when Saddam refused to keep trading oil in dollars, he was taken out. Same thing with Gaddafi. Gaddafi, who was trying to keep the U.S. from militarizing Africa and NATO from militarizing Africa, taken out. Iran, who wanted to start trading oil in currency other than dollars, demonized. So much more to all these situations than what we've been told. It's up to us to find the facts. Continuing with the headlines. New Cold War feeds war machine. From that report, the apparent madness in the Obama administration starting a new Cold War with Russia and China makes sense if viewed from the perspective of the military-industrial complex, which must justify ever larger budgets. And it gets worse than this report. Again, let's go back to 9/11. Does anybody have any idea how much arms sales 9/11 generated? How fortunate for the military-industrial weapons-making complex. Connect the dots. Another headline, online gun store sells 30,000 AR-15s in a week after the Orlando shooting. 30,000. Do people think that having all these weapons and ammunition are going to save them from a planet that doesn't support life? I want to keep bringing that up because it's astounding to me that so many people in their insecurity, think that buying a weapon and a box of ammunition or a case or however much they buy is going to make any difference if the planet doesn't support life. You can feel how intense the sun is on your face. Any of us can that are halfway conscious. It's burning trees up. It's burning foliage up. It's killing plankton. This is a direct result of climate engineering destroying the ozone layer. Though there's other sources like CFCs, those sources mathematically pale in comparison to the damage being done by climate engineering. Ask yourself, is a hairspray can more likely to do more damage to the climate than military tankers dumping 60 or 70 tons of aluminum nanoparticulates and other chemicals into the atmosphere hundreds of times a day? Ask yourself, what's the more likely cause of the damage? Now let's add radio frequency transmissions. We see it everywhere. Anybody who looks up in the sky can see the herringbone patterns crisscrossing in clouds all over the sky. This is from radio frequency manipulation of these particulates, part of the weather modification programs. And these people don't care what they're doing to the atmosphere. So many times I've heard, countless times, people walk away from facing the issue of climate engineering because they say, quote, they wouldn't do this to themselves. That statement is from total ignorance, because we have so many historical examples of what those in power do to the planet as a whole and thus to themselves. How about Project Starfish, the detonation of hydrogen bombs in the magnetosphere just to see what would happen? How intelligent is that? Let's detonate some hydrogen bombs in our atmosphere just to see what happens. This is business as usual. Let's detonate 2,000 plus nuclear bombs on the planet, set up ships and animals and see what it does to everything. They're like twisted, psychotic kids in a sandbox, literally. So back to the headline I just read. Online gun store sells 30,000 AR-15s. This is great for the military-industrial complex, and we have countries buying all kinds of weapons from Western powers. So it's a boom to their business. Do we think that this complex is going to tell us the truth about 9/11, about vaccinations, about climate engineering, or anything else? It's up to us to find the truth. It's there for any who choose to look. But again, for those that are, quote, prepping, that prepping won't save you from a total biosphere implosion, which is what we face. We better focus on the right priorities or we'll have no chance. Another headline, the Supreme Court just created a full-blown police state. The end of the USA cannot be far behind. End of headline. This is what happens again, the desperate power structure, the Patriot Act, the Orwellian terms for things that are anything but. It's not patriotic to go along with what's being done by our government. Detention, indefinite detention without charges, people locked up in places like Guantanamo with no charges ever filed and tortured, and everybody looks the other way. Is this what America's about? It's not what I signed up for. Certainly not what our Constitution states. So where is everybody? Where is everybody in the fight? I know so many people that know what's going on or have a good idea, and yet they're not doing much about it. And I hope that changes. I really hope that changes. I hope that the majority understands the gravity of what's unfolding. Let's remember this with the headline I just read. Supreme Court just created a full-blown police state. Let's remember that Homeland Security and other agencies purchased some 2.4 billion rounds of ammo. Let's remember that in 2010, every doorstep of every citizen in this country was GPSed with no explanation. I tried to reach the Census Bureau myself, was never given an explanation. And let's remember that drone bases are being set up all over the U.S. Do those dots connect? I would say so. Let's connect them all the way through. Biosphere implosion, economic implosion, desperate power structure, preparing to try to control a population that's now been forced to wake up. And let's remember this, aside from those 3 points I just made about the drone bases, the ammo, and the GPS, the climate engineering operations are already dumping highly toxic materials over our heads every single day. If those elements are changed to something more lethal, it's game over, period. We're all getting sicker by the day now with the toxic elements we're breathing. Could get much worse fast. And if you think electing any of the candidate actors again will change anything, think again. Sanders, yesterday, now did a complete 180 and said he would vote for Clinton. It's all theater. It's all theater. The sooner we realize that, the better. Now, again, regarding the environmental issues and the toxins falling on us, here's another headline. Protesters delivered millions of dead bees to the Environmental Protection Agency's Washington headquarters on Wednesday. This is from NBC News. Now, this is interesting as well because when we already have peer-reviewed study to show conclusively that aluminum is killing the bees, we have these environmental groups that can't seem to see the forest from the trees. Yes, Monsanto chemicals are deadly. Yes, they're killing the bees, but that's on a more localized level. What's the bigger picture? And we have the so-called environmental groups that can't seem to see climate engineering no matter what. Why is that? Why is that? Well, we have, again, people who run some of those environmental groups, like Bill McGibbon with 350.org, who receives money from the Rockefeller Foundation, who is part of the military-industrial complex that runs the world. So this is sort of paid opposition, if you will. We have Amy Goodman from Democracy Now!, who receives money from the Ford Foundation and is told what she can and can't talk about. Controlled opposition, again. And we have corporate media that certainly won't tell us anything no matter what. Another headline, TSCA reform, toxic chemicals are still to be allowed under the EPA's chemicals laws. Why? Why would EPA still allow so many toxic chemicals? Because their job is to hide the dangers from the public, as I've stated over and over. This recent headline just backs that up. What I stated earlier in the show, this is another headline. A record 66 million trees have died in California, increasing fire risk. Of course it's increasing fire risk. And why are those trees dying? What's the single greatest cause of those trees dying? It's not just climate change. In fact, the most direct cause of the trees dying in the West is climate engineering. It doesn't mean the climate's not changing. It doesn't mean there's not countless sources of anthropogenic human-caused damage to the climate. There is. We put 100 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere every single day. For those that think that's not a problem, you're not living in reality. We're polluting the planet from every direction, poisoning the oceans, paving the land areas. Those are all huge problems, but climate engineering is what's drying out the climate. Climate engineering is the single largest source of particulate pollution on the planet, period. Climate engineering is what's shredding the ozone layer, period. Climate engineering is what's creating the massive dry lightning strikes that are sparking these fires. Search geoengineering is fueling drought and fires. Search those terms, and you'll find lots of data to back up what I'm saying. So the dead trees are most directly related to climate engineering and the downstream effects from climate engineering. And yes, the beetles are killing the trees. We have these forestry agencies telling people that it's just the beetles. The beetles are a symptom. They're only a symptom of a bigger problem. It's time people face that and understand that these agency officials and scientists are paid to pacify the population, period. And I hope they find their courage, because at this point, they should be considered accomplices to the crimes. If they are not telling the full truth to the population that they have a responsibility to tell that truth to, then they're a part of the problem. Now, about that drying up and the drought-causing effects of climate engineering. And anybody can search this. Geoengineering causes drought. Just search those terms. You'll find lots of data. Las Vegas going dry. Largest reservoir in America reaches record low. That's Lake Mead. I've spent a lot of time on Lake Mead, and it's interesting to look at it now because it's shrunken up to not much more than a puddle. From this report, Las Vegas and its 2 million residents and 40 million tourists a year may have a problem. America's largest reservoir, Lake Mead, reached a record low, nearing levels that would force the Interior Department to declare a shortage, a state of emergency, which will lead to significant cutbacks for Arizona, Nevada, and other states. Well, it's gotten even worse since then. At 1,072 feet elevation, Lake Mead has never been more empty. Continuing from this report, as population growth and heavy demand for water collide with hotter temperatures, again, the planet's in full-blown meltdown, and it's being dried out from climate engineering particulates. It's important to remember that. A warming planet must rain more. The laws of physics say so. 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. Can't rain less unless there's a massive factor that's not being acknowledged. Continuing from the report, reduced snowpack will be noted in the future. There will be an even greater mismatch between supply and demand. An assistant professor at the University of Southern California said, quote, "The question becomes, how to resolve the mismatch across the states that we all depend on the river to support our economic growth. Again, I want to stop there with economic growth. How long can you perpetually grow on a finite planet with finite resources? The whole system is horribly flawed. And how is it that people don't see that? This is a complete impossibility to perpetually grow on a finite planet with finite resources. Now the planet has been decimated. Where do we go from here? Now, on a headline that's a little bit off track, but I want to read it quickly just to show the mentality in some of the desperate countries that are trying to survive. The headline states this: Killing Nemo, cyanide threat to tropical fish. This is how they collect these tropical fish. They spread cyanide throughout the reef. Well, we have the heat killing the reefs all over the globe. We know the Great Barrier Reef, the majority of it just died in the geologic blink of an eye. But we also have things like this: desperate populations trying to collect tropical fish to make some sort of revenue to survive. So they're spreading cyanide in the water to stun the fish so they can collect them. From this report, many of the real-life Nemos swimming in children's fish tanks are caught using cyanide, said researchers on Thursday, which highlighted the danger to corals. Friday's release of Pixar's Finding Dory, an animated film about a forgetful blue tang, will likely boost demand for aquarium specimens in the tropical fish and fuel the poisonous practice used to trap them, said a report. Think about this. Okay, this is just the mentality of so much of the human race. No regard for the consequences. Spreading cyanide all over the reef, killing who knows how many species, just to collect a few that are stunned and at that point damaged to sell to the Western world. And the Western world seems to have no regard for this. Nobody wants to know where these fish are coming from. Nobody wants to know where their oil's coming from. Nobody wants to know what damage is being done to the planet by the notion of endless consumption and endless growth. How long can we go on avoiding the truth? Not much longer. That's a fact. And in regard to the sort of mentality, again, that killed Nemo here, and that type of trajectory for the human race, let's project that onto immediate events that are coming, like the Rio Olympics. I want to plug this mentality in so you can see this mentality is woven throughout the human race and everything we do. Rio de Janeiro declares state of public emergency. Total collapse of security, health, and transport. That's the headline. Rio de Janeiro declares state of public emergency. Total collapse of security, health, and transport. From this report, earlier today, the IAAF announced that Russia track and field athletes would be banned from the Rio Olympics due to allegations of systematic doping. Bear with me because this gets to what's going on in Rio. Rune Anderson, who heads the IAAF task force overseeing Russia's attempts to reform, said that a deep-seated culture of tolerance, or worse, appears not to be material change. No athlete will compete in Rio under the Russian flag, he said. Perhaps instead of fighting this declaration, this is where the report gets more interesting, Putin's response should be a simple thanks, because just hours later, and just 49 days before the start of the Olympics, the Rio state government declared a, quote, state of public calamity. Yes, that's the technical term. Warning of a risk of total collapse in public security, health, and transport, and virtually everything else. Because, as the local government explained, the financial crisis is preventing it from fulfilling its requirements for the games. We don't hear about any of this, do we? That Brazil is descending into collapse, Venezuela, that I've covered in previous shows, descending into total collapse. We don't hear about this. We just see election theater. Now, because of Brexit and its dominoes starting to fall, it's going to be hard to hide a lot of things. Because the Arctic ice is imploding, because we're seeing temperatures never before recorded all over the globe, floods that are beyond record happening as well as the climate system continues to implode and be further torn apart by climate engineering. So we have Rio descending into collapse as the Olympics are about to start. Let's carry that a little bit further forward. Again, the same mentality we saw with the reef poisonings and the same headline hiding that we now know is happening in regard to Rio and the Olympics. Has anybody asked, what about Tokyo the Tokyo Olympics, how much sense does it make to have Olympic Games a stone throw away from a nuclear volcano that's spewing deadly radiation into the atmosphere, into the oceans with no end in sight? No end in sight. And now we learn this. Here's a new headline. We've said this all along. Many have said this. It should have been obvious to all that we were being lied to, as we're being lied to on every level, from vaccinations to climate engineering to deadly radiation. Headline from this last week: Tokyo accused of falsifying Fukushima radiation data. Is that a surprise to anybody? After Fukushima blew up, we had our government shut down radiation detecting facilities on the West Coast. Why aren't people alarmed? We had the so-called public protection agencies in multiple countries escalate their, quote, safe level of radiation as much as 10,000%. How does 10,000% more radiation suddenly become safe? It didn't. We're just simply being lied to, as we are on every level. So again, we have headlines proving that officials lied about Fukushima. From that report, radiation readings conducted by private activists 40 kilometers from the crippled Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power facility are 10 times higher than those published by authorities. Is that a surprise? It shouldn't be. Continuing from the report, not only do we have a continued contamination of the groundwater in the Pacific Ocean by the unstable plant, but the brittle structure of the damaged plant represents itself a serious threat, in particular in our earthquake-prone region. Given the relative proximity of Tokyo, just some 200 kilometers south of Fukushima, this is that close to where the Olympics are proposed to be held. And do people wonder why the, quote, experts build nuclear power plants right on top of fault lines or right next to the ocean where they can get annihilated by a tidal wave? Or how we have so many, quote, experts constructing so many megacities at sea level where they're about to be inundated? It's already happening in Florida. Back to the doctors, back to the vaccinations. Doctors who accept whatever they're told by the vaccination companies, back to the vaccination companies that don't have to report their data because we have protection agencies like EPA willing to lie to protect these corporate interests, period. How is it that a vaccination company is not allowed to be sued? How insane is that? There should be a waiver sign for vaccinations, and if there was a waiver, people would understand there's a risk. And there is a risk, a very real and present risk that's documented. All the way down the line, we have governments, agencies, and a power structure that is totally and completely out of control. So Fukushima and the Olympics, we'll see if that happens. No sane person is going to go to Tokyo to participate in the Olympics with Fukushima getting worse by the day and no technology to fix it. No technology to fix the Fukushima problem. Now, we must understand corporate power to fight it. This is a report from Chris Hedges. Chris Hedges is an exceptional journalist, an exceptional truth teller with all this going on. And I'm only chipping away at the corners here. There's so many stories. I've covered the Hanford situation in Washington. We have salmon now there showing up with tumors all over them in the tributaries that run by this nuclear facility. Is that a surprise? From every direction we're being lied to. Fracking, the damage it's causing, the environmental implosion as a whole. From every level, the corporate structure controls everything. So here's a report from Chris Hedges, again, to try to address this issue. This is from this last week. Quote, the aims of the corporate state are, given the looming collapse of the ecosystem, as deadly, maybe more so, as the acts of mass genocide carried out by the Nazis and Stalin's Soviet Union. The reach and effectiveness of corporate propaganda dwarfs even the huge effort undertaken by Adolf Hitler and Stalin. The layers of deception are sophisticated and effective. News is a state propaganda. Elaborate spectacles and forms of entertainment, all of which ignore reality or pretend the fiction of liberty and progress is real, distract the masses. Education is indoctrination. Intellectuals, along with technocrats and specialists who are obedient to neoliberal and imperial state doctrine, use their academic credentials to deceive the public. The loss of privacy, the constant monitoring of the citizenry, the use of militarized police to carry out indiscriminate acts of lethal violence, a daily reality in a marginal community especially, and the relentless drive to plunge as much as 2/3 of the country into poverty to enrich tiny corporate elite circles, along with the psychosis of permanent war. A dystopia that will be as severe as the totalitarian system that sent tens of millions to their deaths during the reigns of fascism and communism. Until the last moment, this reality will be hidden behind the empty rhetoric of democracy and reform. Repressive regimes gradually institute harsher and harsher forms of control while denying their intentions. By the time a captive population grasps what is happening, it is too late. Think about that report, because it is exactly accurate, and it's happening. And those of us that are trying to tell the truth, how many times have we had quote-unquote friends and even family roll their eyes and walk away without any investigation whatsoever of anything that's uncomfortable or threatening to them? And as I stated earlier in this show, and I've stated many times before, psychoanalysis proves and confirms that is not the sign of a healthy mind. To aggressively deny any investigation of what appears to be happening or any information presented. Our population has been trained and conditioned to respond with denial to any uncomfortable truths that are presented, and to accuse those of presenting the truths as, quote, conspiracy theorists, the term coined and propagated by the CIA as a tool to condition that population to knee-jerk response and mentally shut down. Continuing from the report from Chris Hedges, quote, our corporate masters know what is coming. They know that as the ecosystem breaks down, as financial dislocations create new global financial meltdowns, as natural resources are poisoned or exhausted, despair will give way to panic and rage. They know coastal cities will be covered by rising sea levels, crop yields will plummet, soaring temperatures will make whole parts of the globe uninhabitable. The oceans will become dead zones, hundreds of millions of refugees will flee in desperation, and complex structures of government and organization will break down. They know that the legitimacy of corporate power and neoliberalism, as potent and utopian an ideology as fascism or communism, will crumble. The goal is to keep us fooled and demobilized as long as possible. Final statement from this report. We have little time left. Climate change, even as we halt all carbon emissions today, will still bring rising temperatures, havoc, instability, and systems collapse to the majority of the planet. As hard-hitting and accurate as this report is, it doesn't even take into account the global climate engineering assault, which is the greatest environmental assault of all, which is the greatest and most immediate danger to life on Earth of all, short of nuclear cataclysm. And this report doesn't even address that. Let's add that on top of everything I just stated. So, as we plummet toward a new and very harsh reality, again, power structure much more desperate, another headline that plugs right into this theme. Quote, CIA chief just confirmed, quote, war on terror has created a lot more terrorists. What a surprise. That's the goal. They have to have this sort of tool to terrorize the population and convince them to give up their sense of reason along with their rights. From this report, John Brennan tells Senate Intelligence Committee, quote, our efforts have not reduced the group's terrorism capability, meaning ISIS, and global reach. No, because they're fueling ISIS. They're supporting ISIS. I just went over that earlier in this show. American population simply needs to wake up. Another excerpt from this report. Central Intelligence Agency Director John Brennan said Thursday that, quote, years into the United States fight against Islamic State, the terrorist group's reach and power have not been diminished, and that it has even more fighters than Al-Qaeda had in its height. That should be no surprise to any of us. This is the goal. There has to be such an adversary to get the U.S. population to support the military-industrial complex. And again, I'm not saying ISIS isn't real. I'm not saying the Muslim fundamentalism is not real and alarming. Not all Muslims, but just this fundamentalist movement. ISIS is a barbaric group, so why are we and our allies supporting them? Why did we and our allies help to spawn them? You have to connect all the dots. As far as ISIS goes, I want to read one more headline that will paint an ever more clear picture. The headline, quote, merchants of death, Obama and Clinton run weapons to ISIS from Libya, say intelligence documents. From this report, although the news media and Democrats believe the government control of guns owned by Americans is politically necessary, what may be equally important is the investigation into President Barack Obama, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, illegal weapons deal in Libya that helped to arm the Syrian-based Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The thinking in 2012 was that the fall of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad made a U.S. Muslim terrorist alliance worth the few negative stories or Republican criticism. Quote, let's be honest with ourselves. Obama and Clinton knew they could pull off any scam on Americans with little, if any, backlash. They learned it through experience, said former intelligence operative and police counterterrorism unit member Josiah Malinsky. Quote, even today, in the midst of a presidential election, a large number of voters will turn a blind eye to crooked Hillary's shenanigans, past, present, and future, he added. Americans turn a blind eye to almost everything if it interferes with their own comfort zones. That's very, very tragic and ultimately deadly if we stay on this course. Americans have to wake up. Most especially our military needs to wake up. Our military brothers and sisters need to wake up. I was just sent from a friend and a neighbor, local Shasta County Sheriff, a slideshow of a U.S. Marine veteran that lost both arms and both legs. And the slideshow was unimaginably moving as he and his wife fought through his recovery. If anyone has a right to run for president, it would be a man like that or a woman like that who has been through what the war hawks in Washington, who have never been to a front line, can't even imagine. People like that should have a right to help to govern societies around the globe that have been built on militarism by people who are not connected to the consequences. How many people in our government have ever seen the front line? Obama, Clinton, Bush, Reagan, any of them? They're actors. They're all actors, not just Reagan. All of them are actors. None of them have seen the front line, and none of them understand the unimaginable consequences of war. And even though ISIS is murderous and barbaric, is it any less barbaric to drop a bomb from a drone where you don't have to see the carnage, and where, in some cases, wedding parties of 50 people were completely blown apart? We don't hear about that in America, do we? We don't hear about 90% of the drone casualties being civilian. We don't hear about any of that. Is it any less barbaric? I'm asking the question. Do we have drone operators in Las Vegas, Nevada, killing people in Asia and then going home after work as if nothing happened? How is that less barbaric? What separates us from what ISIS is doing, especially when we're funding, fueling, and spawning ISIS? Continuing from this report about Clinton running weapons to ISIS. U.S. intelligence documents released to a government watchdog has confirmed the suspicions that the United States and some of its so-called coalition partners, which I named earlier, had actually facilitated the rise of al-Qaeda in Iraq, no surprise, business as usual, which became ISIS as an effective adversary against the government of Syrian dictator President Assad. In addition, ISIS members were initially trained by members and hired contractors from the Central Intelligence Agency at facilities in Jordan in 2012. The original goal was to weaken the Syrian government. Business as usual. Every tool imaginable is used by the criminal cabal that runs the Western power structure, and I'm not saying it's any different, any less criminal with Russia and China in many ways, but they are not the ones fueling World War III at this moment. It's the Western power structure. So tools like geoengineering are used to topple countries, drought them out, destabilize the society, cut off their food supply, and we have terrorist groups like ISIS also used to topple governments around the globe. Whatever serves the power structure, they have no regard for the consequences, none. And we're all about to reap those consequences if we don't wake up soon. Now, we're at a crossroad. We're absolutely at a crossroad. And there's a lot more stories I could cover. I mean, there's countless stories from all over the globe. We have as many as 200 million acres may burn in Siberia. We have record flooding in so many locations. We have unimaginable heat waves coming to locations all over the globe that's going to get worse very rapidly because what we face is non-linear. On every front, what we face is non-linear. From biosphere implosion, climate disintegration, economic collapse, it's not the scenario where you see this coming from a long distance away and you have a lot of time to plan and maneuver because it's predictable. It's not. Once the breaking point is reached and once links in the chain start to drop out, the reality can change overnight, and it will on many fronts, and many links in the chain are going to drop out soon. The best response we can have is to face these issues head on, absolutely without flinching. On that note, remember the quotes I read at the beginning of this broadcast. Quotes that are 2,000 years old, but that state clearly how we should respond to what's happening around us. I'll repeat those quotes. From Epictetus, and this is my most treasured literature. And there's nuggets everywhere in every tradition. I acknowledge that. But I simply had this put in my lap when I was 14 years old, and it changed the way I looked at the world for my entire life, my entire adult life. Again, from Epictetus, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Second quote, circumstances don't make the man. They only reveal him to himself. This is where we must polish our sense of purpose and our sense of philosophy, because we face a gathering storm that's unimaginable. The sooner we face that fact, the better our chances will be. Another quote from several hundred years ago. There are two histories, the lying official one and the secret one, in which are the true causes of events. Think about this. This quote was from the early 1800s. Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. When we go back even 2,000 years, again, to the Stoic philosophers or biblical texts or other great traditions, these issues are addressed. Human nature, an unwillingness to face reality, and the consequences that come from that. I want to finish with a final quote from Epictetus. I'm sorry, the bias I have toward that particular source of philosophy is immense, because I've never found anything I could argue with, ever. And I've read his writings no less than 100 times. Because philosophy is like working out. You can't do it once and say, I'm fit. That's it. Don't have to do anymore. Your philosophy must be exercised every day to face the gathering storm that we face. Every day, exercised, or you will become demobilized and ineffective. Epictetus said this 2,000 years ago. First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. If we want to be a part of the cure and not the disease, we must face the truth head on and begin to share that truth with anybody who will listen effectively and efficiently. Don't rant, don't rave, Simply share data. It's up to all of us. If we were to sound the alarm in time, it will take all of us working together. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.
JJ Inc. from Against the Wall, and you're listening to UCY.